Hello and welcome to the Chapter 47 quiz review. Just remember that this quiz is only over the first two sections of the chapter. Looking over the Muddiest Points questions, the first question I wanted to go over was, what is an antigen? Somebody asked. So different cells all have different proteins on their cell membranes in different shapes that can be used to recognize them. So the proteins on this green cell here have a different shape than the proteins on this blue cell, different shape than the proteins on this red cell here. So since cells can't see color, but they can recognize shapes, and those distinctive shapes of proteins, the pieces of the pathogen that have those protein shapes, those are antigen. They're parts that can be used to recognize that virus or that bacteria, whatever it is. That's what an antigen is. Okay, and that relates right to the next question, which is how do vaccines work? When you get a vaccine, you get an injection. They're injecting antigen, pieces of pathogen that can be used to recognize it, into your body. That antigen is going to be received by a cell, a macrophage. It says here antigen presenting cell. It's going to be a big macrophage. When that, or a helper T cell. When that antigen is received by the macrophage or helper T cell, that activates your immune response. The helper T cell is going to make a whole bunch of copies of that antigen and broadcast that out to killer T cells, to B cells, to become plasma cells, and all of that. You're starting your immune response by adding an antigen. That's better than getting the actual pathogen and getting sick. You can just skip that process by just getting a piece of that pathogen that creates the same response. Another way to think, another graphic for how vaccines work, you take a weakened form of the disease or just a piece of that disease. The body thinks it's under threat. It builds up antibodies and immunity, what it calls in this graphic the ninjas. And then the next time that pathogen gets into you, your body overwhelms it right away. So vaccines are using antigens in order to create an immune memory for a pathogen. All right, the most common question on the Muddiest Points was, what are the types of white blood cells we need to know and what do they do? So we'll just go over them really quickly. Again, there's another PowerPoint in that is we went over in class. All that's on the Google Drive if you want to check that out. These are different images, and I'll try to explain a slightly different way for you. All the cells, the white blood cells you need to know, all 8 of them are listed right here. Let's take them one at a time. This neutrophil. A neutrophil, we saw a video of a neutrophil chasing down and consuming a bacteria cell. That's what they do. They chase bacteria down or pathogens down and consume them. They eat them. That's called phagocytosis. So here's a picture of a macrophage doing a very similar thing, step by step. But the macrophage, unlike the neutrophil, is going to spit those back out. These are some macrophages down here too. They're distinctive because of their little octopus kind of arms. When a macrophage takes in a pathogen, it chops it into pieces and spits it back out, as you can see here. Those pieces of pathogen, those are going to be antigens. They're going to be these external pieces that can be used to recognize that pathogen in the future. So macrophages are making antigens and releasing them out naturally after you get infected. Third type of white blood cell is a natural killer cell. Here we have a natural killer cell, goes up to a infected cell and pokes a hole in it and kills that cell. Natural killer cells are doing that in response to histamine to kill those cells. All of these cells, your neutrophil, your natural killer cell, and your macrophage, are going to be more active when there's histamine around, and they'll attack any kind of pathogen or cell infected by any kind of pathogen, making them non-specific immune cells. So the rest of the cells, white blood cells that we need to know, are all part of the specific immune system. So the macrophage is part of the non-specific immune response, but since it releases antigen, it's the beginning also of the specific immune response. These antigens that are released by the macrophage get received by a helper T cell. Helper T cell is going to make copies of those antigens and send them out into the blood to other cells. Some of the cells that receive those extra antigens from the helper T cell are called cytotoxic T cells or killer T cells. Those killer T cells go to infected body cells and kill them. Now, the natural killer cell was killing cells because of histamine. The killer T cells, or the cytotoxic T cells, are going to kill cells that have antigen. So they have the pathogen inside them. Same message, antibody message that's coming from the helper T cell is also received by a B cell. It's called a B lymphocyte here. a B cell. When a B cell gets that message, it goes through a bunch of mitosis and forms plasma cells and memory cells. Memory cells weren't in this diagram. Here's a memory cell. What memory cells do is they remember infections that you got. So if you had food poisoning like E. coli, your memory cells will remember that E. coli. And the next time you get it, they'll respond faster. But some of these B cells, and most of them actually, when they go through mitosis, will form plasma cells. Plasma cells release antibodies. Antibodies attach to antigen, and since antigens are pieces of pathogen, you're going to have a bunch of antibodies attacking and surrounding pathogens. So here's the pathogen, consumed by macrophage. Macrophage chews it up, spits out the pieces, which are antigen. Antigen signal gets sent to the B cell, becomes a plasma cell that makes antibodies, proteins that stick to that antigen specifically, and releases them into the blood. Okay, lots of different cell types. I get that. Final question that was posted on the Muddiest Points was, what's the difference between the cell-mediated versus humoral immune response? So when we're talking about humoral, humor means fluid, not like funny. It means fluid. In this case, the fluid is the lymph fluid or the blood. So anything that's happening in the blood that's not involving directly cells, i.e., the antibody response that the plasma cells are releasing, those antibodies, that's humoral. It's just a fluid response. No specific cell is involved with that other than the making of those antibodies. Cell-mediated response is going to be like the cytotoxic T cell goes and kills your body cell. That's a cell doing something, right? That cell's actively doing that. That's cell-mediated, as opposed to these antibodies, which are not cells, going and doing things. So if a cell is a part of that directly, the killing of the pathogen or of the infected cell, that's cell-mediated. If it's a fluid in the blood, like antibodies dissolved in the blood, that's humoral response. Okay, so there were no questions about Koch's postulates. I just wanted to remind you that they do exist, and they were part of Chapter 47. And then also the inflammatory response, the idea that a cell releases histamine, causes increased blood flow, which is going to cause swelling, fever, response. That was also part of Chapter 47. And interferon being a molecule that's released into the blood that causes other cells to kind of shut down. So don't forget some of those things. They weren't there. Overall, I think if you know the types of white blood cells and you're familiar with what an infectious disease is, you're going to be in good shape for this quiz.